Time now for the Sunday Talk. Tonight, the politics of the East-West divide. This week at the First Ministers' Conference, the country's premiers publicly squabbled over the proposed Energy East pipeline after Quebec announced it would seek an injunction against the project, reigniting red-hot tensions between the East and the West.
What kind of a situation must exist before your government would approve of a new pipeline from the west to the Montreal area?
Ever since the Pierre Trudeau era, with Alberta's oil ridges, there's been a battle over who benefits.
Canada is a sharing nation.
Trudeau Sr. thought Alberta should share its oil with the rest of Canada at a low cost. It was called the National Energy Program.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 of you holding signs like little boys.
Things got nasty. Western alienation, a buzzword. The sentiment, a bumper sticker showing up everywhere. Then, one of their own was Prime Minister for a decade.
Jobs by creating a national energy market, decreasing our dependence on foreign oil.
Stephen Harper was a staunch supporter of the oil industry and other core Western interests. And playing referee at big provincial gatherings was low on his list. Now, the new Trudeau wants everyone to get along. At the First Ministers' Conference in more than a decade, Alberta oil was back on the agenda. The proposed Energy East pipeline would take oil all the way to New Brunswick for export. But Quebec is seeking an injunction until it passes an environmental review. Alberta and Saskatchewan's leaders were not pleased.
And I've asked our trade minister and our trade officials to look at what options we have to say, you know, enough is enough.
I was getting quite ready to come in here with guns blazing about that. I will simply keep my holster close at hand.
So now, just like his father, Justin Trudeau is straddling a divide.
And I've never felt that highlighting points of disagreement or differing views in this country is a threat to national unity. We are much stronger than that.
I'm joined by our panelists. Tasha Carradine is political commentator and columnist. John Moore is a talk radio host in Toronto. And Jen Gerson is a columnist with the National Post. She joins us from Calgary tonight. So a lot of flashbacks there for anyone over a certain age. But John, are we looking at Trudeau versus the West Part 2 here?
I don't think so. I mean, I think one of the things we have to admit, and maybe we'll get into this a little later, it was probably a mistake of him to try and convene all the ministers. I honestly think that Harper was smart not to do it. I love Canada. I think Canada's a fantastic country, but when we pretend that we have this grand national interest, I don't think it's there. We tend to think of Newfoundland as cute, the Maritimes as quaint, Quebec is demanding and annoying, Ontario's dictatorial, Alberta is high-handed. Nobody thinks about Alberta and or BC, and BC doesn't think much about the rest of Canada. I think it's foolish to pretend there are grand national interests at all, so let's just negotiate the different individual interests of the province.
I'm going to bring Jen in here just a moment, Tasha. Are we facing a nasty divide again? What's your read?
I don't think that it is a nasty divide in the same way that the National Energy Program was a nasty divide. I mean, the dynamics here are very, very different. I'd point out, you know, during the National Energy Program, you know, it was routine to deride the Premier of Alberta, Peter Lougheed at the time, as a blue-eyed sheik. The elder Trudeau got away with showing just utter contempt for the West and you know, imposing the National Energy Program because it reflected a broad consensus, particularly in central Canada, that Alberta's oil resources did belong to all of Canada and that the spoil should be divvied up accordingly. That was the dynamic of that era, and I don't think we're anywhere near that. If anything, what I see emerging now isn't really so much about East versus West or Alberta versus the rest. What I see emerging is a much, much more muscular set of provinces, that we see provinces increasingly demanding their interests and their environmental and economic interests be put on the table and be made paramount. And I mean, if I look at even the last week, you know, the biggest conflict from last week interprovincially wasn't between Alberta and Quebec. It was actually between BC and Alberta. You know, that was actually the increasing animosity between BC and Alberta is the highlight reel of some of these fights going forward. I think Justin Trudeau is actually putting himself in a position to play the nice guy, to play the middle ground, to play the moderator between increasingly nasty interprovincial disputes.
Lots there. What do you think, Tasha?
Well, I think that Justin Trudeau would like to be the moderator. I think that's, in fact, what he said he would be in this situation. I will take Jen's point on the environmental issue, though, as something that was not a around at the time that Pierre Trudeau Sr. was dealing with national energy policy back in the 70s. It was not something that was really as strong an issue, whereas now you do see a lot of that coming out of Quebec and BC as well. I think that one of the other issues, though, is also the timing of this, which comes at the same time that Quebec is asking for a subsidy for Bombardier. So
$1 billion,
again,
yeah.
exactly. And so that $1 billion cloud that's hovering over the Quebec government's already given Bombardier money. Will Ottawa pony up now? That is what's causing, I think, this east-west tension, because people are saying, well, if you're going to help them, why aren't you helping us out west when we need it most?
Just want to get a sense from you in Calgary, Jen, like how serious is the grievance? You know, we've got today again, you had in Quebec protesters saying this pipeline is a huge threat to the environment. Wall is saying, no, come on, it's not really about that. What's your sense from Alberta?
The sense that I get from Alberta is that a lot of that there are absolutely legitimate environmental concerns, and I think most Albertans are happy to recognize and deal with those concerns. But the sense is that the environmental concerns are really just a smokescreen for a lot of the old east-west grievances. It's not a coincidence that even though the actual concerns themselves appear to be new, all the old divisions and fault lines are still there, just exactly as they were 40 years ago, right? The sense I think out here is that how much of this is you actually being concerned about the safety of these pipelines, which are overwhelmingly pretty safe, and how much of this is about you trying to, keep the uppity oil wealth of Alberta down again, just like you did back in the day. That I think. Now, I'm not saying how much of that is reasonable or not. I'm just saying that there is an underlying concern about that.
John?
I would say.
I think that is Alberta perhaps being oversensitive, and I think Alberta has always been oversensitive because, with all due respect, and I'll get plenty of hate mail over this, Alberta has treated the NEP as if it's a beaten dog, and it's never gotten over it. The National Energy Program may have been a terrible idea, but it had nothing to do with the collapse of oil in the 1980s. But back to Quebec's motives. I think people think because Quebec has tried to break up the country twice that Quebec hates the rest of the country. Quebec spends almost no time thinking about the rest of the country. Quebec is obsessed with itself, and it's obsessed with leftist issues like the environment. Not that that's a bad thing, but this really, I would attribute this to its environmentalism, not to its sort of finger in the eye aspect.
I certainly want to see your mailbox, because let me tell you this. I think Quebec is also an issue here because Quebec was on the receiving end of equalization for a very long time from Alberta. And I think that is part of this whole east-west dynamic, is that it's like, okay, Alberta's been footing the bill for a lot of things, like child care at $7 a day, expansive programs the rest of the country doesn't see, cheap university, and now we want something from you, and you're not giving us what we need. So it's not just historical; it's actually quite recent.
I also have to point out here that I don't think that Western alienation begins and ends with the National Energy Program. You want to talk about Western alienation, we got to go back a century. We have to talk about how the borders were created. We have to talk about the history of transportation and industrial policy in this country. We have to talk about free trade. Traditionally, one of the big bugbears of Western alienation has been free trade with the U.S., not about oil resources at all. Well, oil resources came later, but free trade was actually a major issue of these alienation issues. I think one of the problems here is that there's a real lack of education across Canada about what some of these particular regional grievances are and where they have their roots. I mean, I was raised in BC, and I remember hearing about the traditional grievances of Quebec. I remember hearing about the decapitation thesis. We hear all about the issues facing central Canada. What we never actually learned about was the National Energy Program.
There's a reason for that. There's a reason. The reason historically is because I think that the East, both politically and economically, was the engine of Canadian growth, and therefore that dominance helped it assert itself. And what happened in the last 10 years, and you mentioned this in the setup pack, Wendy, that you had the Harper government was there, wanted to build the pipelines. It didn't happen. Had it happened, I think this would be very different, because moving that center of gravity
west. And now
west,
you have a Quebecer as PM, another Trudeau, and,
yes,
and
that
power is shifting.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I think something else you have to consider is not all of the environmental objections to the pipelines are to the pipelines themselves. I think that Stephen Harper and Alberta overplayed for 10 years the notion that there was nothing wrong with the oil sands, that they were not an environmental problem. And much like the seal hunt, public opinion lapped them, and we ended up in trouble. So Jen may be right to a certain extent that Alberta is being punished by Quebec for that environmental insensitivity, and they're hanging it on the pipelines.
And I would tend to agree with that. I think that you're right. I don't think there's any dispute, even in Alberta at this point, that Stephen Harper did not play this the right way, that in trying to appear to go so hard in favor of the oil and gas industry, that he actually undermined the credibility of the federal government and undermined the sense that the federal government could be a fair arbiter of these issues.
Well, he's trying very hard to get everyone to get along.
Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, Justin Trudeau. Stephen
Right.
Harper, it was a plague on First Ministers' conferences for a decade.
Yeah.
Who's right?
Well, neither of them. I mean, we have to see how Justin Trudeau's conferences play out. This first one, clearly, I think his expectations were too high. He was talking about setting a national carbon price before he went in, and that quickly dissolved into realpolitik, which is, okay, let's study this for 6 more months and see what we get out of that. It's going to be more individualized, as the Environment Minister has said. I think, though, Stephen Harper should have had First Ministers' conferences, if only for show. And I don't say that lightly, simply because people felt that he neglected the provinces, and I think that was a legitimate grievance. He didn't, for 7 years, get them together. That is way too long.
But now you've got, Quebec's seeking an injunction. You've got Brad Wall suggesting, oh, yeah, well, maybe I'll have my trade officials look for something that might hurt you guys. That seems to be the suggestion. Are we heading down a dangerous path here, Jen, do you think?
Yeah, I do think. I mean, this comes back to my first point about what happens when you have increasingly muscular provinces filling up a vacuum that's being left from the federal government, and it's a power vacuum, right?
But does Justin Trudeau, is he best to try and bring people together, or?
Probably at first. Look, I think that there is an optics and a perception issue that needs to be addressed. I think the federal government does need to reach out to these provinces and start treating them on a more equal basis, but at a certain point, the federal government's going to have to federal government, and Justin Trudeau's going to have to piss somebody off, and there's no way around that at this point.
I don't know if we're allowed to say that. We're almost out of time, but John, last point.
I think his problem is he wants to be a conciliator, and he has to be a broker, and he has to make some choices, and he has to pick a fight with some people, because we do not have a lot of common interests here, and so ultimately you can't get everyone to hold hands and come to an agreement. Eventually you got to push people around.
Well, he was given a headdress this week and an Aboriginal name, He Who Keeps on Trying. We'll see what happens. Jen, thanks so much for joining us from Calgary, and thanks to you in Toronto.